We're back, and we're back to member for, where'd you go? Rescues West.
Thank you. We've just had a discussion, and if you, with your acknowledgement, I'd like to leave the floor to my colleague here from Fredericton, and it has been agreed that I would come back right after him. Thank you.
I see member for Fredericton South, the Leader of his party.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my colleagues from the two other opposition parties to accommodate me here for the next half hour. And good afternoon to the Minister and her staff. I want to join my voice to the others concerning the terrible tragedy that happened in the Miramichi. It's tough, and a lot of people are going through some tough times that are going to be with them for their lives. I also want to acknowledge the tremendous anxiety and stress many people are going through who've been put out of their homes because of the flood or are on the verge of being put out of their homes, and of course the damage that is occurring to their properties. But it's the anxiety and stress right now, Mr. Chair, that's so difficult to handle by so many, and it's reassuring, I think, for many that the military has been mobilized. I know that was the case in my riding. For one of the flooded neighborhoods in my riding, when the military arrived, people felt tremendously comforted by that, and they provided real needed assistance. So it's important to express my appreciation, certainly on behalf of many people that they've already helped, that the Premier called on them early. So that's tremendous. And also, well, that's enough, I guess, on that. Well, I guess the other thing I would say is the responders out there of all sorts who are helping are reaching a point where they're getting awful tired, I'm sure. And I think it's important to recognize that. It's not over. It's going to get worse than before it gets better downstream, for sure. So I hope everyone has patience with them as well. I know there's been a few incidents at some of the roadblocks, and it's really important that people understand the time and effort that wears on our responders who are working so hard to support all New Brunswickers here. I'll start with a question around income assistance, Mr. Chair, to the Speaker through you. So I think she said there are about 22,000 people on social assistance right now. One of the concerns I have about this is that and many organizations working to help alleviate poverty and support the poor share this, that essentially income assistance has been frozen for about a third of those receiving it since 2010, so for 9 years. And then for the others, the other 2/3, their social assistance rates have been frozen since 2014, so for 5 years. So what that pays for now is far less than it paid for 5 or 10 years ago. 10 years ago is for those receiving the social assistance rate of $537 for individuals hasn't changed in that period. So it's not enough really to live on at all to begin with. And with it being eroded so severely by inflation, my question to the Minister is, in her department's estimates, is there provision for adjusting those income assistance rates this year to reflect the impacts of inflation over the last 5 and 10 years?
So through you, Mr. Chair, to the member opposite and the leader of his party, nice to see him here and thank him for the question. We've had this conversation before, and nobody ever believes that $537 is enough to live on. I was part of a government in 2010 who had raised that number by 100%. And proud that we were a government that saw that social assistance reform needed to happen, and we're working on it. And we're continuing to work on it. The Premier has committed to social assistance reform. This year, the priority will be on ensuring that we are able to empower those who are able to work, to help them work their way back either into the workforce or to re-enter into the workforce. I do not see an increase in those rates this year. There is no extra money in the budget for that. But we will. But it is always my goal that if someone is receiving $537 a month, which I need to clarify is for an employable individual, if they're not employable, if they are disabled, then it's our job, all of us in this chamber, the 49 MLAs and our constituency offices, to help to work to ensure that they receive higher benefits and higher services, so that we can hopefully meet their needs for their day-to-day basis. And I hope that we will continue to empower them into changing their life for a better one.
Thank you to the Minister for that direct answer. It obviously helps if people have access to subsidized or supported housing in terms of their income. One person with designated needs who aren't particularly employable is only receiving $576. So it's not a huge difference. But on the housing question, according to the budget, there's $1 million reduction in the housing services budget from last year's estimates. So can the Minister explain what the change there is?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So the reason that there's a slight reduction in the housing budget is because we have some federal agreements that are expiring. So there's no change to the services. It's just that those federal agreements are expiring, and so that takes a little bit of money out of there. But we're offering the same programs as before, and as you know, there's a housing strategy that we are eager to release. We are still awaiting federal approval on the 3-year action plan that is part of that, and hoping for that. I was actually hoping we'd have it before today, but we're looking very forward to being able to share that with you as soon as we can.
Thank you. And as we know, there's a waiting list of some 5,000 people for subsidized housing. So I do want to ask some specific questions around the bilateral agreement on the National Housing Strategy that was signed back in July. So in this fiscal year, it provided for 2 initiatives, the New Brunswick Housing Priorities Initiative and the Canadian Community Housing Initiative. So the funding was provided in those 2 categories, and it was to be matched 50-50. So for this fiscal year, for New Brunswick priorities, $8.2 million was to be available, and for the Canada Community Housing Initiative part of it, there was $1.6 million to be provided on the federal side. So if you add that up, that works out to be that works out to be 16.4 million with the provincial match for New Brunswick's priorities, and 3.2 for Canada the Canada Community Housing Initiative. Now, for the 16.4 million combined, 8.2 federal, 8.2 provincial dollars, the New Brunswick Priorities Initiative is quite broad, which can include support for for-profit landlords, including as well as social housing, nonprofit housing, cooperatives, Indigenous housing providers, and so on. So that's the bulk of the money. 8.2 plus 8.2 is 16.4 million for this fiscal. For the Canadian Community Housing Initiative, it's 1.6 federal, 1.6 provincial, so it's 3.2. But overall, there's a total of $19.6 million in this fiscal year associated with that federal and provincial money combined. Can the minister tell me if that money is reflected in these estimates before us?
So to the member, through you, Mr. Chair. So the simple answer is yes. Those numbers are reflected in the $91.4 million in the entire budget. So yes, they are there.
Just to be clear, that means that the $9.8 million under this agreement from the federal government, the 8.2 for the New Brunswick Priorities Housing Initiative and the 1.6 for the Canada Community Housing Initiative are embedded in the $91.4 million in the estimates?
Yes, that is correct.
So if that's the case, then, through you, Mr. Chair, to the Minister, doesn't that mean that, in fact, there's a more significant reduction over last year's estimates than appears, because at least 9.8 million has been added that wasn't available last year?
Okay. I thought the same thing, but as I've explained actually in the media beforehand, that with the federal government, you know, there's lengths of times for programs, and this a 5-year program with the federal government ended, another one's beginning. So monies are rolled over. And so while we're still finalizing the details of the action plan with the federal government, the monies are there. So in the housing budget, out of the 91.4, 32.4 million is federal, 59 million is provincial.
Okay, so to be clear, that means that in the last fiscal year, there was $9.8 million reflected from the federal government side in the last year's budget.
So I just want to, it's a little bit complicated sometimes, but so the 9.8 was, in this budget, was simply a replacement of the 9.8 that existed from the previous plan. And so we've gone forward with the same amount, the 9.8 we've received from the federal government going forward.
Okay, thank you to the minister. That's clear then. When will the provincial housing panel see the final plan that was submitted to CMHC regarding the agreement here?
We are anticipating that response any day now. It will be a public document, and so as soon as we get it, it's going to be available.
Okay, thank you to the minister. I want to move on to a question around a couple of questions around seniors. The budget's been cut, and maybe you answered this, I missed it, but the budget for the senior secretariat or the aging secretariat was cut in half in these estimates. So I'd like the minister to explain the rationale for that.
Thank the member for the question. So the Senior Secretariat is an advisory division, essentially. And so we are looking for efficiencies in our department. There are no layoffs with regards to this lowering of the budget item. There's no cuts in service. This is an advisory division that we will be working closely with to see how we can incorporate what they do. They share responsibility for the functions of the roundtable, which is about 70 members throughout the province, and we're going to be looking at how we can make that roundtable and the way that we get advice from them in a more efficient way. So this has been, it's where we found some savings that doesn't affect services, and that still gives us an attachment to the employees that we have.
So my question, Mr. Chair, to the Minister is, does it affect what I thought was an increase in policy capacity and strategic planning for seniors in long-term care by creating the agent secretariat? So does it diminish the ability to develop policy, do strategic planning, provide advice to the Minister based on that?
No, I think I'm confident when I say this that it's not going to diminish the ability. In fact, we feel that we're going to be able to better integrate the data and the policy division of this into the workings with seniors and long-term care. And as the member opposite knows, I'm very much an evidence-based decision maker, and so we feel that we're going to be able to bring this together in a better way, and I'm confident that we're going to see good results from it.
Okay, well, time will tell. The proof is in the pudding, as they always say. So let me ask you about the nursing homes. So the former government made quite a few commitments to expanding the available space for long-term care for seniors in nursing homes with the construction of new ones, many more than actually contracts were signed for. So the first question here is whether you're picking up and maintaining that same commitment in terms of the expansion in nursing home capacity that has been announced under the previous government, or whether you're planning changes.
Mr. Chair, through you to the member opposite. So the RFQ process was completed, and so we're just at the stage of having the ability to release the RFPs. Again, there is a cabinet process, and that's very much in the works. We're continuing the work of the nursing home plan right now. That's ongoing with the number of construction and replacements that have shown in the other plan, and those they're going to be coming forward very soon. I know that 5 months is some time, but it's not quite yet enough for us to get to the finalization to make these public for you, but I can assure you that we're continuing with the nursing home plan.
So just to clear this up, does that mean that the number of spaces, essentially, or the number of beds in total that were announced under the previous government are captured by the RFQ process that's just been completed, or not? Or is the RFQ process a subset of the total number of beds that essentially were announced by the previous government?
So this was a three-phase process, and the first phase addresses the same thing. We're not, we're not anticipating changes. But I do want to mention that, we may need to go at the first phase even, I guess, how do I say this? There are some contracts that were not responded to, and particularly for 3B beds. So we haven't finalized how we're going to address that. But that work is ongoing now.
Thank you. And is there any, do you contemplate changing in any way the RFQ process to level the playing field for our community-based nonprofit nursing homes to provide extra beds in the future?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So government indeed has directed our department. We've supported the fact that the playing field does need to be leveled. We need to make sure that every opportunity is there for every organization. This is not in my opinion, this is not a resource that we can only have one supplier for. So we need to make sure that we have viable options for every community. And so our direction has been that we not only level the playing field, but we also try to ensure that we have value for the taxpayer. So we are looking at all of those.
Thank you to the Minister. That's good to hear. Finally, a couple of questions around child welfare and disabilities. With respect to estimates, comparing apples to apples, child welfare services were $126,960 last year, the original estimates, and budgeted this year for $135,451. But what was the actual expenditure in that envelope of money for child welfare services?
Those final numbers are still in the process, and public accounts books aren't expected to be ready until September. However, we want to give you as much information as possible. So the third quarter projection projected that the year-end budget would be 135.7 million.
Thank you, and I'll ask a parallel question for the disability support services. So the budget, the estimates from last year were for 156,490, not thousand, million, what are we doing here, million. Million. And these estimates have 178,407,000. So if I could get a similar third quarter projection for what was spent on disability support services last year.
The projection was 189.90 million for the end of fiscal 18-19. Just a note on that, the informal caregiver was in that budget as well.
Okay, thank you to the Minister, through you, Mr. Chair, for your answers, and to your staff for their assistance. And again, I want to extend my appreciation to my colleagues for accommodating my schedule this afternoon. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Je reconnais le député de Restigouche-Ouest.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my